All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Sivan. To thank Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin for dedicating all the Sherman Joshos this month in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for their niece Chava Tzipora Bas Chayim Malka, and Shmuley and Liba Dinovitz for dedicating the Sherman Joshos this month in the Schus of an Aliyah for the Neshama of Rav Peretz Avram Ben Rabbi Yamin Moshe Zichron Levrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah, the family Nechama, and Kol Cholei Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Kuf Yud Beis 112. We are picking up on Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Beis 111b, and we left off at the two dots. No, maybe a little bit earlier. Okay. I'm going to do 9 lines up. 2, 4, 6, 8. Sorry. Right. So good. Good. Karikan. That's where we left off. 2, 4. Right. 2, 4, 6, 8. 10 lines up from the bottom. Sorry about that. Karikan. Lahakim la'achiv shem. So remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to the concept of the katan yavam. Right? So again, we learned about the concept that yibum could technically be affected by kitanim. So yesterday we began the Gemara's discussion with the idea that the Mishnah clearly does not reflect the view of Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir holds that katan and kitana cannot do yibum. Rabbi Meir is concerned that how do you know they're going to be yibum eligible? So if they're not yibum eligible and you allow them to go ahead and do yibum, you've effectively allowed for an erva scenario to unfold. Okay, so we established the Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Meir. The Gemara raises another question. Kari kan lahakim la'achiv shem. I will say, what is the entire point of the mitzvah of yibum? The entire point of yibum is to go ahead and to provide progeny, to provide offspring for the deceased brother. So the Gemara says, v'hailav bar hachihu. But this individual, this yavam, is a katan. If he is a katan, he is unable to go ahead and provide offspring for his brother. Similarly, again, if she is a kitana, she's unable to go ahead and provide offspring for her deceased husband. So ultimately, again, how is this a sanctioned yibum union? Amrabai Amrakra Yevamo Yavo Alea Koldu. Because the pasuk says Yevamo Yavo Alea, that literally again the yavam will go ahead and do yibum with the widow. And I will say that's the mitzvah of yibum. In other words, there's no guarantee in any yibum scenario that children are going to occur. The mitzvah of yibum is for the brother-in-law to marry the sister-in-law. That's the mitzvah. See, even if again in this type of situation we know that immediately the union will not produce children, there's still a mitzvah of yibum. So the Gemara says, Rava Amarava says, "B'lav haki nami lo masis amrit." Rava said the truth is, either way, even without this, we could have advanced the following idea. Mi'ika midi, da'ashta asirile, ulabasar shaita sharia. So Abai says like this, and it's actually a very interesting idea. Abai says, is there anything that lemaisa right now is asr, and later on will become mutter? In other words, it doesn't make sense to say that you're going to have a yibum scenario where now they can't do yibum, but wait a couple of years and they can do yibum. V'ha amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav, kol yivama she'ein ani kore b'shas nefili yivama yava alea, hari hi ke'eshes ach sheish labanim. Remember again, this goes back to what we learned before, that when is yibum eligibility established? When is it established? At the time of death. So lamais again, either you are yibum eligible at the time of death, or you're not yibum eligible at the time of death. But there's no such thing as being ineligible now and becoming eligible later on. So the Gemara says, because again, essentially, if halacha lamaisa, you are not yibum eligible at the time of death, then lamaisa, again, if you're not yibum eligible, then it's an iser erva. Those are the only two options that are available. Either it's yibum or it's erva. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ema hachinami amekra ki yeshvu achim yachtov afilu ben yom echad. So I will say, finally, the Gemara says the truth is, the pasuk says as follows. So we learned this drasha before. Kieshvu achim yachtav means what? When brothers will dwell with each other in the world. If you remember again, I will say the Gemara darshaned that in order for the mitzvah of Yibum to apply, the brothers have to have had been alive at the same time, even if just what? For one day. Now the fact that halacha is on the books, that even if the brothers are literally again, just happen to exist in the same world for one day with each other, tells us that what? That halacha l'maisa, even a minor brother is going to be subject to the mitzvah of Yibum. So I will say what comes out from here is something very interesting. That halacha l'maisa, as much as the mitzvah of Yibum ultimately is to go ahead and have children, but l'maisa, the phrase of Yevamo Yava Aleh teaches me that the mitzvah of Yibum applies even in a situation of kitanim. So again, Rabbi say in a general situation, what we would do is we would wait until the katan reached the age of majority in order to do something, right? What the Mishnah is telling me is ex post facto. If a katan did in fact perform a mitzvah of Yibum, such a Yibum would be halachically valid. So again, if lechatchila this came to us, we would wait. But b'di'eved, if the katan actually affected Yibum, whether with another kitana or even with a gedola, ultimately, again, the Yibum would in fact be effective. The chiddush is, even though now he's a katan, maybe unable to have children, or maybe she's a kitana, unable to have children, Yevamo Yava Aleha says, as long as there's two technically eligible people able to affect Yibum, halacha l'maaseh it works. Quite interesting. So the Gemara goes weiter. Yevamos amar b'sok shloshim yom. So what's the next part of the Mishnah? Yevamos amar b'sok shloshim. So what's, remember again, this was, the Yevamos says within 30 days after Yibum occurred, lo nivalti. The Yavam did not have relations with me. So the Gemara says, what's the halacha in that case? Kol fenoso sheyachlos. We force him to do chalitza. If she comes after 30 days, then halacha l'maisa, we don't force him, but we request of him. Says the Gemara, what's going on over here? Man tana da'at tlasin yomin mokim inish anafshe. Then I will say, what's the logic? You see, we assume that if halacha l'maisa, she comes within 30 days, it is possible for him to abstain for 30 days. So if she shows up and says within 30 days, she shows up within the first 30 days, and she says he never consummated the Yibum, we believe that. We can believe that claim because we assume that a man could live within a same home with a woman for less than 30 days and abstain. So man tana dat lasin yomin mokim inish anafshe. Who is the opinion who says that until 30 days a person could withhold himself from being intimate with a woman? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Meir. This Sanya, because Rabbi Meir says, Tainus besulim kol shloshim div Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that after a couple gets married, within the first 30 days, a husband could go ahead and show up to Beis Din and say, my wife wasn't a besula. She wasn't a besula. Then I will say, what's the impact of saying that she wasn't a besula? Rashi says over here, lahafsid ksuvasa. This would cause her to lose her ksuva. Rashi says, kol shloshim yom, why 30 days? The yachol liton lo ba'alti ad ata. Because again, it's within the realm of normalcy for a man to say, I didn't consummate my marriage within the first 30 days. So up to 30 days, ultimately, again, we could believe this claim. However, again, the Gemara said, Rabbi Yossi disagrees. He says, nistra la'alter, lo nistra af la'achar kama shanim. Rabbi Yossi says, interestingly enough, it's not a function of time as much as it's a function of the couple being secluded together. Once they're secluded, we assume that there's bia, right? So again, if they're secluded, then ultimately he loses the ability to make the claim. In other words, if they're secluded and then he doesn't make the claim immediately after seclusion, he's no longer believed. If for some reason there was never any yichud, then potentially he can make the claim even years later. So we'll say, but the point over here is Rabbi Meir is the opinion who holds that halacha l'maisa, up to 30 days, a man could be potentially abstinent. After that, we don't believe him. Therefore, again, let's go back to the Mishnah. Therefore, right, Rachel and Shimon do Yibum, right? Rachel shows up in Beis Din within 30 days, and she says, the Yavam never consummated Yibum. What's the halacha, says the Mishnah? We believe her. We believe her. What's the effect of believing her? We summon Shimon to Beis and we tell Shimon, okay, do chalitza. You never consummated yibum, so do chalitza. Says the Gemara. Rabbi says, Afilu tim Rabbi Yossi. It could even be Rabbi Yossi. How so? Ad kamal kam Rabbi Yossi hasam ela barusaso the gisba because of Rabbi Yossi. It's interesting. Rabbi Yossi was talking about a case of marriage. Right? In a case of marriage, there's already, again, a connection, a familiarity. So according to Rabbi Yossi says the first time that they're secluded, we assume that bia occurred. Because again, there's a familiarity, one with the other. Aval eishes achiv, but when it comes to your brother's wife, top of Kuf Yud Beis, mivzaz buzzes minei. There's a certain element of mivzaz buzz literally means embarrassment. What it means is this might not be able to remember again, a yibum relationship is often one that one is thrown into, of course, not of their own choosing. So there may be a little bit of an awkwardness or a little bit of an embarrassment in this type of relationship. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, it could even be that Rabbi Yossi would agree that it's not about seclusion, it's not about yichud, but rather what is it about? It's about time. It's about time. So maybe even Rabbi Yossi would agree that when it comes to a yibum situation, it could be that even if they're alone with each other, that up to 30 days bia didn't occur. So maybe even he would agree. To which the Gemara says, that's fine. So we'll say, so therefore again, this is our first chelik. So it seems to be now the Gemara wants to suggest that actually maybe even everyone could agree. So the machlokes, and it's actually an interesting machlokes, we'll see it in Kiddushin, where the machlokes that the Gemara is quoting over here, where again, a tainus basulim. A man says, I got married to a woman, I thought she was a basula. It turns out she's not a basula. So there's an interesting machlokes, how long what's the window for making that claim? Rabbi Meir says, up until 30 days, because we assume it's possible that they did not consummate the marriage within the first 30 days. That's possible. Rabbi Yossi says, no, seclusion. So the Gemara is suggesting our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir, to which the Gemara says, maybe even Rabbi Yossi agrees over here. Therefore, what we have in our Mishnah, a woman shows up in Beis Din, Rachel shows up in Beis Din, within 30 days after having done Yibum with her brother-in-law Shimon, she says, Yibum has never been consummated. What's Beis Din's reaction to that? What's their reaction? We believe her. And therefore, summon Shimon, you didn't consummate, do chalitza. To which the Gemara says, well, once again, so why is it that we just force him to do chalitza? Why not force him to do yibum? In other words, why not go and summon him to Beis Din and say, hey, Shimon, we heard you didn't do yibum. Let's go. Right? Do yibum. In other words, the Mishnah sounds like over here there's only one option. And the only option is to do chalitza. But the truth is, if we know that he hasn't consummated yibum, there's still two options on the table, right? What are the two options? Yibum or chalitza. So, in other words, why only force him to go out and do chalitza? In other words, what we should do is summon him to Beis Din and say, hey, Shimon, get your act together. You have to do one thing or the other, right? Yibum or chalitza. But why are you only putting chalitza on the table? This is very interesting. Well, so here we go. This is where I mentioned yesterday. Rashi kind of Rashi spoiled it a little. Rashi gave us this information. Amarav b'shegita yotze mitachas yada. Oh, okay. So Rabbi say she's showing up in Beis Din. And halacha l'maisa, she comes with a get in her hand. Okay. So now Rabbi say, now here's what's happening over here. So she's showing up in Beis Din within 30 days. She's saying, my husband never consummated yibum. Or I should say, my husband, right? Shimon, my brother-in-law never consummated yibum. And he gave me a get. She's claiming it's a get without bia. He's claiming that what? There was bia, and here's the get. So the Gemara says, so meisvei, Yevamos sha'amr, so we'll say, so that's what's happening over here. So in a case like that, so we'll say, so now, if you bring this all together, when she shows up in Beis Din with this get, and she's claiming he just gave me a get, which also we know what's the impact of a get. But let's say Yavam gives Yevama a get before Yibum or Chalitza has been performed. What's the effect of a get? Right, it shuts down the ability for Yibum, but still requires Chalitza. So she says, I have a get that essentially shuts the door on Yibum, which is fine, but I still need Chalitza. He's claiming you don't need Chalitza. We had Bia. We had bia. So ultimately, again, we had bia. We consummated the relationship, and here's your get. Here's your get. You're good to go. You're good to go. That's the machlokes. So now the Mishnah says within 30 days we believe her claim because we assume that it's possible that bia didn't occur, that this was just a get to preclude the possibility of yibum. We summon him to Beis Din and he's got to do chalitza. So basically, the Gemara is the kasha. Yevamos shamar b'soch shloshim yom lo nivalti. If Yevamos says within 30 days there was no bia, he never consummated yibum. Bein shu omer ba'alti, bein shu omer lo ba'alti. Kolfin oso sheyach lotzla. So Rabbi will say it's very interesting. Within 30 days, we believe her. In other words, if she says bia did not occur, we believe that claim. We believe that claim. And therefore, we summon him to Beis Din and we force him to do chalitza. By the way, now, I'm sorry, I didn't mention something. Now you also understand why, according to the Mishnah, remember what the Gemara's question was. The Gemara says, well, if we're summoning him to Beis Din within 30 days, why do you just force him to do chalitza? He could do yibum as well. Now we understand why isn't yibum an option, Rabbi say. Why isn't yibum an option? Because there's a get. Right, correct. Because there's a get. So now I understand the only option on the table now is chalitza. So Rabbi say, therefore, watch the Raisa. So again, she shows up in Beis Din within 30 days and she says we never had relations. Whether he says we did or he says we didn't, kolfin oso sheyach lotzla. We force him to do chalitza. La'achar shloshim yom. Now, if it's after 30 days, mevakshin heimeno sheyach lotzla. We ask him to do chalitza. Now, both say, what changes within 30 days, after 30 days? See, after 30 days, we find it highly improbable that a couple lived together and didn't have bia. We find it highly improbable. So therefore, both say, she's showing up, it's 35 days, right? 40 days since they were supposed to have done yibum. She shows up in Beis Din, we never consummated the yibum relationship. He says, yes, we did. She has a get. Now I will say, the truth is, in that case, we're more inclined to believe him than to believe her, just because of human nature. But nevertheless, we ask him to perform chalitza. We can't compel him, because the metzius is such that we assume that bia did occur. But lamaisa, we ask him to do it. Be a good guy. You gave her again. In other words, remember, I will say, in this case, either way, he doesn't want to be married to her, right? Because he's claiming there was bia and then a get. So we ask him, okay, fine. So no skin off your back, just do chalitza. So we can't force him, because again, human nature is on his side. But lemaisa, we ask him to go ahead and perform chalitza. Good. So it says the Gemara, la'achar shloshim yom mevakshim sheyach lotz. Here we go. What about this case? She says there was bia. This is a reverse case now. She says there was bia. He says there was no bia. Harize yotzi beget. It will say in this case, ultimately again, he needs to give her a get. Hu omer ba'alti v'hi omeres lo nivalti. He says there was relations. She says there wasn't relations. Afa pi shechazer va'amar lo ba'alti. Even if he recants, he says, you know what? Sorry, made a mistake. Wrong woman. Right. There was no bia. Nevertheless, tzricha get v'chalitza. Ultimately, again, she requires get and chalitza. So this contradicts what we were saying before. To which the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Ami, tzricha chalitza im gita. The Rabbi say our Mishnah is saying the same thing. That halacha lamaisa. Even though the previous prices sounds like that potentially there's a case where all she needs is a get, to which the Gemara says, no. Our Mishnah is also highlighting the same idea. Whenever we talk about, again, that she needs chalitza, it's always chalitza with the get. In other words, Rabbi say, the get, the chalitza that we're talking about is accompanying the get. The case in our Mishnah, Rabbi say, remember again, this is the novelty that you would not have seen from reading the Mishnah. The case in our Mishnah is where she is showing up in Beis Din. And what does she have in her hand? She has a get. Rabbi say, what's the machlokes between Shimon and Rachel in this case? What's the machlokes? The machlokes is the nature of that get. You see, Rachel's claiming, what's the nature of the get? The get is there because he gave me the get as a display that he does not want to perform yibum with me. So now, okay, the door to yibum is closed, but I still need chalitza. He's claiming, what's the nature of the get? We consummated the relationship. she was my wife. I gave her a bona fide get. Right? This is her get. She's a divorcee. There's nothing more to talk about. So Rabbi says, so again, the Gemara says here, let's go weiter. Rav Ashi says, Hasam get lezekaso, hacha get lebiaso. Ultimately, we'll say the Gemara says, it also serves two purposes. She's claiming over here that when she shows up, the get that she received was a get that severed the zika. Now, again, Rabbi say that's fine. A get doesn't really sever the zika. What does a get do? Like we said before, a get shuts the door on yibum. But ultimately, again, you need chalitza in order to fully sever the zika. Hacha get labiyasa. Rabbi say, but again, conversely, when there's a situation when he's claiming, on again the Bryce's case, where they were married, ultimately, again, the get has the ability to sever the marriage. So the Gemara says as follows: Hano shnei modim da'asu lekamei derava. So I'll say, interestingly enough, there was a following situation of two people, right, Rachel and Shimon, who came before Rava, and both husband and wife agreed. But when the husband and wife, both Yavam and Yevama, right? So we'll call them again. Rachel and Shimon agreed that what? There was no bia. So we'll say they're showing up in Beis Din. Let's call it 50 days. I'm just giving an arbitrary number. 50, something more than 30, right? 50 days after they were supposed to have affected Yibum, consummated Yibum. They both show up, they both come before Rava, and they say they both agree to Rava. We never had bia. Rashi says over here, Shnei Modim almost right across. Shelo nivala umeikara amar ba'alti. So both say now they're both agreeing that halacha l'maisa there was never bia. So the Gemara says, Amalu Rava, chalotzula, v'shara tigra. So Rava says, fine. Okay, listen, if you both agree, do chalitza, and let's get on with our lives, right? In other words, so fine. In other words, what's more to talk about? Amalu Rav Sharvia l'Rava, v'tanya tzricha get v'chalitza. But one second. But halacha l'maisa, we learned in the Brisa that you require both a get and chalitza, to which the Gemara says, Itanya, Tanya, to which Rav says, okay, if that's what the Brisa says, I stand corrected. So the Gemara goes right there. Ba'minei hon, b'reid Rav Nachman, tzara samahu. Suppose it's interesting. What about in this kind of case about a co-wife? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Tzara samahu. Yevamos shekansa hayavam v'niftra tzarasa v'amra Yevama la'achar zman lo nivalti mahu le'asrat tzarasa. So we'll say, listen to this. So let's say Reuven dies. Reuven was married to Rachel and Leah. So Rachel and Leah fall to Shimon. Shimon does Yibum with Rachel. Shimon falls Yibum to Rachel. It turns out that what? So fine. So we'll say, so what happens after Shimon does Yibum with Rachel? What happens to Leah? Free and clear. She's done. So Rachel goes on with her life. Then I will say, what happens? Sometime later, Rachel shows up in Beis Din, and she says, I never consummated my relationship with Shimon. So I will say, so now what's the shaila? What's the impact of this on Leah? Right? Remember again, Leah's going on with her life. I will say, it's even possible that's what? It's even possible that Leah's gotten remarried. Now Rachel's showing up and saying Yibum never occurred. So what's the impact on Leah? What's the impact on Leah the Tzara? To which the Gemara says, Amar Lei, so we'll say this is very interesting. From the co-wife perspective, what the Gemara is saying is, once Shimon and Rachel say that they've agreed to do Yibum, right? They go home together. At that point in time, Leah is free and clear. She's done with this. Which is fascinating, to the point that even if Rachel shows back up in Beis Din with Shimon, right? And Rachel's saying there was never any bia, there was never any yibum. Within 30 days, outside of 30 days, that is an issue that concerns Rachel and Shimon and does not concern Leah at all. As far as Leah is concerned, she's done, which I will say is such a fascinating halacha. Because think about this, obviously, what Rachel did or didn't do does really have a direct impact. But you can't, the halacha can't, you can't have a sustainable halacha like that. Because ultimately, again, there has to be a certain point in time where we say, case closed. Okay, Rachel, you want to come back to Beis Din? This is now a specific issue between you and your Yavam. But as far as the tzara, the co-wife is concerned, her case is closed. Quite incredible. So I'll just point out over here. So this is how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam says this is in Hilchos Yibum B'Chalitza Parak Beis Halacha Hey Yevamos shenisyav ma va'amar b'sok shloshim yom lo nivalti va'af al pi shu omer ba'alti v'gersha kolfin oso sheyachlotz choil v'kidem v'gersha beget. So I will say the halacha is that if she shows up, I'll just say this outside. See, if she shows up within 30 days. And says, Rachel shows up within 30 days, and she says, there was never any biyah. Now, I both say, now, she shows up, there's never any biyah. The shaila is, what is she coming to Beis Din with? If she's not coming to Beis Din with a get, so then we summon Shimon, and we say to Shimon what? Listen, either do Yibum or Chalitza, because if there's no get, Rabbi say, all the options are on the table. If, however, she shows up with a get, then we force him to do Chalitza. If, however, ultimately, again, she shows up after 30 days, and again, with a get in hand, then halacha l'maisa, we go ahead and we can't force him to do chalitza. Why can't we force him to do chalitza? Because we'll say, once again, we assume that a person is not going to be abstinent for 30 days living under the same roof with a woman, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, what we do is we request of him to do chalitza. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa, I should say the halacha l'maisa pretty much mirrors the Mishnah as we have it. Incredible. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Hano deres hana. So let's remember again, the Mishnah's last case, an interesting one, was a woman who makes a neder, makes a vow, precluding herself from getting benefit from her brother-in-law. So I will say, so now of course the interesting point is going to be what? What's the impact of that neder upon Yibum? Right? So the Mishnah made an interesting distinction. What was the interesting distinction in the Mishnah? If she made the neder while her husband was still alive, then ultimately what? The neder stands. The neder stands. I will say the neder stands to the point that halacha l'maisa. So we'll say, so now just to play this out. So Rachel is married to Reuven. While Reuven is alive, Rachel says, I don't like my brother-in-law, whatever the reason is. I make a neder precluding myself from getting any benefit from him. 3 weeks later, right, Reuven dies. She falls to Yibum before Shimon. The Mishnah says we force Shimon to do chalitza. Person to do chalitza. Now I will say, now remember again, if she made the neder after her husband died, then what? Then we request of Shimon to do chalitza. However, the Mishnah's last case was, if it's clear that she had kavana to make a neder, so as to circumvent any possibility of Yibum, in that situation, Rabbi Osai, we request of the Yavam to do chalitza, but we don't force him. So says the Gemara, Tanan Hasam. The Rabbi says it's very interesting. Barishona hayu omrim shalosh nashim yotzos v'not los ksuva. The Rabbi say used to be that originally we said there are 3 women who ultimately have to leave a marriage, but even though they have to leave, they leave with their ksuva. Who are these 3 women? Listen to this. Ha'omeres teme'ani lecha. So let's say a woman says, this is the wife of a Kohen, who says, I was violated. Then I both say, if a wife of a Yisrael is violated, she is permitted to her husband. If Rahman al-Islam, the wife of a Kohen, is violated, she is not permitted to her husband. So let's say wife of a Kohen shows up, she tells her husband, unfortunately, I was violated. And therefore, I'm asura to you. Rashi says over here, Ha'omeres t'mani lecha, Eishes Kohen she'amar l'bayla ne'enasti, de'isra'ale, uksuva lo mifsida. So we'll say, so she says, ultimately, I was violated. Or Hashamayim beini lebeinecha. So we'll say, so literally again, the heavens are between me and you. So we'll say, this is actually an interesting, Rashi says, what does this mean? Hashamayim beinecha, galev yadol lefanav, she'eincha niskak li kederach b'nei adam, ve'ein ish eilochiach ben shenenu. She says to her husband, only God knows that you are not intimate with me. So she is claiming over here that her husband does not fulfill his conjugal obligations, right? He does not fulfill his intimacy obligations, so she's making a claim against him. And obviously, a claim like that is pretty difficult to support in Beis Din, right? So that's why she's going to say again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that you're not intimate with me. Or Netula ani mina Yehudim. So we'll say, what does this mean? Rashi says, Netula ani mina Yehudim literally means I'm removed from the Jews. Rashi says, Nadrahi shaloti baile Yehudim. She says, I will not have any relations with any Jews. Umida asra nafsha kuli alma shmamina tashmish kashala va'anusehi. So I will say, now we assume that if a woman makes that type of neder, that I must see that relations perhaps are painful for her, and therefore she's unable to be intimate. So obviously, if she's making that neder, that impacts her husband as well. So we'll say these are three cases where ultimately, again, either a wife of a Kohen is claiming I was violated, or she's claiming you're not intimate with me, or halacha l'maaseh, she makes an neder prohibiting herself from any Jew. So I'm saying all of these cases, Chazal ruled that she leaves the marriage, because obviously, again, these marriages are not sustainable, but she gets her ksuva. And I will say, now this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, Chazru lomar, shalote isha nosenes eineh ba'acher, umikalkelas al baila. So I will say, it's very interesting. The problem was, Chazal were concerned that these situations could be easily exploited as well. In other words, let's say a woman just wants out of a marriage and wants her ksuva as well. So if she's the wife of a Kohen, she could just say, I was violated by someone. And I will say, now again, remember, in the original formulation of this halacha, there's no need for any level of eidos. Her word, she's believed. So she says again, I was violated. Okay, so she leaves that ksuva. She says, you're never intimate with me. Okay, like I said, no burden of proof. Or ultimately, again, she makes a neder. So Chazal were concerned about the possible exploitation of these halachas. So rather, again, halacha was reformed. Ella, ha'omeres temani lecha, tavi raya ledvareha. So I will say, if a woman says she was violated, she has to bring some level of proof. In other words, I will say, it doesn't mean necessarily that she has to produce edim for this, but there has to be at least some level of evidence to this particular claim. So the Gemara says, if she comes to Beis Din and she says to Beis Din, my husband is not intimate with me, so I will say Beis Din will encourage the husband to divorce his wife. They can't compel him. Why can't they compel him? Because we'll say there's no proof that what she's saying is accurate. She's making a claim, and Beis Din will say to the husband, listen, be a good guy. If you're not fulfilling a basic intimate need for your wife, why are you staying married to her, right? It's a divorce her. So they'll request it, but they can't compel it. So the Gemara says, if she makes a neder and she says, I'm removed from all Jews, Yafer Chelko, he should annul his portion of that neder, umishamashto, and he's permitted to be intimate with her, and ultimately she remains usher to everyone else, which Rabbi says is not really a big deal if she's usher to everybody else, because why? She's a married woman anyway. Were she to get divorced or her husband were to be widowed, she might have a problem with that neder. So Rabbi says, so therefore Chazal reforged those three halachas. Netula minim Yehudim liyavamahu. So let's play this out for just a moment. So right, Rachel's married to Ruvain. Rachel makes a neder. The neder is Netula ani Yehudim. I removed from all Jews, which again is a neder precluding her ability to be intimate with any Jewish man. So what's the halacha? We say husband has the ability to annul his portion of that neder. So he annuls his chelik, and that allows him to go ahead and remain married with his wife, Fine. Now it happens, Rabbi say, Reuven dies. Rachel falls to Yibum to Shimon. So Rabbi say, what's the shaila? Can she do Yibum with Shimon knowing that she has this neder? In other words, what do we do with this? She has this neder sitting on her. Does that neder preclude her from doing Yibum or not? To which the Gemara says, Mi maska daita demayis baila v'nafla kame yavamalo. Then Rabbi say, here's what's very interesting. The way the Nedarim work in two ways. Number one, that the verbiage of Nedarim goes after the way that people speak, the vernacular, right? And number two, Nedarim are also based on a person's mindset. So Rabbi say, here's the shaila. When Rachel made that neder, did she have in mind that neder could devolve upon her brother-in-law or not? In other words, Rabbi say, let's play this out. Did she have in mind that it should develop on her brother-in-law? In other words, does she think about, well, maybe one day my husband will die without children. I'll fall to Yibum to my brother-in-law, so this neder should apply to my brother-in-law. Or does she say, no, I don't even think about my brother-in-law. Why don't I think about my brother-in-law? Why don't I think about my brother-in-law in terms of this neder? Why? He's an erva. The same way that I don't think about this neder applying to my brother or my father or right, I don't think about this neder applying to my brother-in-law because he's an erva. So I will say, here's the fascinating shaila. Do we say that in her mindset, since there is a possibility that there be a set of circumstances through which she would marry her brother-in-law, she has in mind that this type of neder devolves upon her brother-in-law? Or do we say no, her brother-in-law is not even in her mind at all, because right now as she's making this neder, he's a what? He's a what? He's an erva. He's a fascinating shaila. Rav Amar Yavam Eno Kibal. Rav says the Yavam is not like the husband. Ushmul Amar Yavam Harihi Kibal. That I was saying, what is that lush to me? Look at Rashi. Eno Kibal. Shiyeh Tzarech Lahafer Kibal. Tadaita de Bal Nodra. V'Tzarech Hula Afer. Val Yavam Mutaris Pula Afara. So most of this is interesting. When Rav says that the Yavam is not like the husband, it means that the Yavam is not subject to the neder. She never had the Yavam in mind when she made this neder, because a woman doesn't think about the possibility of her husband dying without children, and therefore, again, she might fall to Yibum to her brother-in-law. And therefore, again, Rav says the Yavam is not included in the neder. She never had him in mind when making the neder. Shmuel says, no, the Yavam is just like the husband, i.e., he was in her mindset when making the neder. Amr Abai says, it would appear that the halacha really follows Rav, that namely the Yavam is not included in the neder. Why? Disnan hanoderes hanoa mi Yevama b'chaye baila. Because what do we learn in our Mishnah? If a woman makes a neder not to get hana from her brother-in-law, if she made the neder during the lifetime of her husband, kolfin also sheyachlots. Then Abba said the husband dies, she's now a surah to her brother-in-law. We force the Yavam to do chalitza. Vim isa demaska adaite. Now Abba say if at the end of the day, that Allah Chalamais, again, she has it in mind on the days, mivakshin mi boile. Ultimately, again, halacha lamaisa, we shouldn't say, Rabbi say, so now, if it's true that ultimately, again, she has this in mind, then ultimately, Rabbi say, in other words, if we say that even when she makes the neder, during her husband's lifetime, that she has in mind her yavam, then what, Rabbi say? Then this is a neder targeted to avoid yibum. Anytime we have a neder targeted to avoid yibum, what does the Mishnah say? We don't force the yavam to do chalitza. What do? We ask him to do chalitza. If that's the case, that she has in mind her brother-in-law, then even when she made the neder during the lifetime of her husband, we can't force the yavam, but rather what? We should ask him. Hacham asking, and what's the case? Be'isha sheyesh labanim. Ultimately, what's talking about a case of a woman who has children. Dechuli haylo maska adaita. Rabbi said, in other words, she has children. So she's not thinking about the possibility of yibum, right? So therefore, again, halacha. Now, there could be yibum. Why? Because first of all, they could be her children, not his children. And you could also have a scenario where, remember, even if there are children, if the children predecease the husband, right, and then he dies, there could be an obligation of yibum. But Pashas, it could just be even a case of where it's her children and not his children. So in that case, we'll say she's not thinking about yibum. So because she's not thinking about yibum, if she made the neder during her husband's lifetime, halacha l'maisa, we assume that she just didn't have in mind the yavam. To which the Gemara says, "Aval ein labanim mai." But l'maisa, again, if she didn't have children, Pashas, she would be thinking about the yavam. If that's the case, Mevakshin. Then Abba said that would be a case where halacha l'maisa, even if she made the neder during the lifetime of her husband, if she doesn't have children, based on what you just said, it should be that she has in mind for her yavam as well. In which case, again, that is a neder targeted to avoid yibum. And anytime she makes a neder to avoid yibum, we don't force the yavam to do chalitza. So we ask him. Therefore, if that's the case, adatani im niskavna lakach afilu b'chayei baila. Mevakshin mimena shiyachlots liflog v'lisnei bididei. Rabbi say we should splice that case. When is this so? Ultimately, again, that if she made the neder during the lifetime of her husband, that we force the yavam to go ahead and do chalitza b'shiyesh labanim. That's if she has children. Aval in labanim, but if she doesn't have children, mevakshin. Ultimately, what? We should only request of the yavam, because in that case, I'd have to be concerned that she had explicit intent to preclude yibum. Elishmamina, loshna yesh labanim, veloshna in labanim, kolfenoso kirav shmamina. Rather, I will say, this is very interesting. From the Mishnah, I will say, from the fact that the Mishnah says that if a woman makes a neder during the lifetime of her husband, not to get benefit from her brother-in-law, right? That's her neder, right? Reuven is alive and well. Rachel makes a neder. I preclude myself from getting any benefit from Shimon. So we'll say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Then Reuven dies. No children, right? Rachel falls to Yibam to Shimon. What's the halacha? We force Shimon to do chalitza. Now, I will say the fact that we force Shimon to do chalitza means that when a woman makes a neder during the lifetime of her husband, she's not thinking about Yibam. She's not thinking about Yibum, right? Halacha, and the fact that the Mishnah makes some distinction, she did have children, didn't have children, indicates to us that during the lifetime of her husband, she's not focused on the possibility of Yibum. And I'm about to say this reflects the position of Rav. Let's go back, let's just bring this all together. When a woman makes, remember again, let's go back. A woman makes a neder. What's the neder? Netula ani min Yehudim. She goes ahead and she says, I'm removed from the Jewish people. So remember again, I'm about to say, what do we do with that neder? We tell husband, be mefer, annul your part of that neder, and you could go ahead and continue to live with your wife. Halacha l'maisa, after that, what happens? Reuven dies. She falls to Yibum to Shimon. So I will say, what's the shaila? Does the neder preclude her from going ahead and doing Yibum? So I will say, what's the fundamental shaila? When she made this neder, did she have in mind the possibility of Yibum? Rav says no, Shmuel says yes. And I both say, it turns out we paskin like Rav. We assume that a woman during the course of marriage is not really thinking about Yibum. So that's why when she makes the neder, Netula ani mina Yehudim, she never had in mind for her brother-in-law. Because her brother-in-law is an erva anyway, and she never had in mind about the possibility of Yibum down the road. Therefore, when her husband dies and she falls to Yibum to Shimon, she's totally permitted to do Yibum with Shimon. Similarly, you'll say that's our Mishnah. That's why halacha l'maisa, when she's married to Reuven, she gets into a fight with her brother-in-law. She just doesn't like her brother-in-law, or for whatever the reason, she just feels like making a neder. Rachel says, Shimon, I'm not getting any benefit from you. And I will say, we do not look at that neder as a premeditated attempt to avoid Yibum, right? We just look at it as a neder to preclude benefit from her brother-in-law. Why? The common theme, Rabbi says, we assume that a woman does not take proactive measures or does not even really think about the possibility of Yibum while still married to her husband. Good, I will say, Hajjun Allah, Beishamai, Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. All right, there was some very interesting cases here. Here we go. Cheresh. Shenasa pikachos. So I will say this is a cheresh, a deaf mute, who marries we'll call it a normal woman. Upikeach shenasa charashas, and a pikeach, right, or a normal guy who marries a charashas. So imratza lahotzi yotzi, v'imratza lekayim mikayim. If they want to get divorced, they could get divorced, and if they want to remain married, they could remain married. Then I will say you're going to see the overwhelming, earth-shattering, right, chiddush of this Mishnah is that what? A cheresh can get married. Our whole life, I will say, we've been conditioned to think that cheresh, shota, v'katan lack das. If you lack das, then what can't you affect? Marriage. Marriage is a transaction. It doesn't sound very romantic, right? But marriage is there is a transactional piece to marriage. So we're going to see over here, again, the Gemara is going to ask, we're going to go through a whole bunch of cases. The Gemara is going to say, wait, one second. Cheresh can get married. You didn't miss anything, right? It's just that the Mishnah presupposes that a Cheresh can get married. The Gemara is going to ask where we know that from. But again, let's go through all the cases. So we'll say, Kishem shu kones biramiza, kachumosi biramiza. So the Gemara says, by the way, how does a Cheresh get married? Because if a person is deaf and mute, we'll say, again, we know, how do you get married? You take an item of value, you go over to a woman, right? You say, Hari'at mikudeshas li, hopefully she doesn't say, wait, who are you? Right? And I also say, right, she accepts, right? That's Kiddushin. So it requires Amira, it requires speech, and it requires Das. So a Cheresh, even if a Cheresh has some level of Das, as we're going to talk about, he doesn't have Dibor. So how does he affect Kiddushin? Remiza. Right? Remiza literally means signaling, right? So we'll see. Rashi says over here, Keshem shekonis beremiza, matam gamakuloma kiddushin kach gerushin v'chein bikeh becharashes beremiza, kana sheramaz be'etzpa ach nisratzis lo. I will say the way a cheresh, the way kiddushin and gerushin is affected with a cheresh is through remiza, through signaling, signing. Again, I will say we'll get into it, but that's what the Gemara says. So pikach shenasa pikacha. Similarly, again, if a pikach marries a pikacha, so I will say this is just a regular case. Reuven marries Rachel. By the way, no yibum yet over here. These are just regular marriage cases, right? So pikach, right? So Reuven marries Rachel, and they're both typical regular people. And what happens? V'nischarsha. Now Rachel becomes a cheresh, or chareshes. Imratza yotzi, v'imratza yekayim. So ultimately, again, if Reuven wants to remain married to her, he can remain married to her. If he wants to divorce her, he could divorce her. Now I will say we're going to see why could he divorce her if she is a chareshes. Because we'll remember again, technically speaking, gerushin doesn't really require the consent or the das of the woman. Salach alamaisa. Again, we'll see all of this in greater depth. But even if she becomes a chareshes, he could divorce her. So the Gemara from Ratzei Kayim nishtatis lo yotzi. If she becomes a shota, right? If she goes insane, then he cannot divorce her. And I will say, we'll see why that is. We'll see why that distinction. Nischareshu onishtate. I will say, let's say again, Reuven marries Rachel. At the time of marriage, he's totally normal. Then he becomes a cheresh, or he becomes a shota. Eino motziu lamas. Then I will say he can never divorce her. Now again, why can't he divorce her? Because gerushin requires das, he doesn't have das. And I will say, I just want to point out over here, you'll see how the Mishnah seemingly like flip-flops a little bit. Does a cheresh have das? A cheresh not have das? If enough for a cheresh to do it. So again, we'll get into all of this. Rabbi Yochanan says, why is it that if the wife becomes a cheresh, the couple can get divorced? But if the husband becomes a cheresh, the couple could get divorced. Amrullah, they said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, very simple. Eina doma ha'ish hamagarish isha miskareshes. Because we'll say you can't compare the two cases. Sha'isha yotze l'rtzona, v'shlo l'rtzona. A woman could get divorced whether she consents or doesn't consent. Va'ish eino motzi ela l'rtzono. A man could only divorce a woman with literally means with consent. But what it means is with full and complete das. Hence the distinction. Hey Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda, ala chareshes she'esiya avia. Let's listen to this case. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudguda spoke about the following case. A chareshes was married off by her father. So let's remember again, what happens when a father, kiddushay kitana, what happens when a father marries off his daughter? Right? Biblical marriage. And I will say, here's the incredible case. What's the nature of when a chareshes, if you have a minor chareshes, right? The chareshes kitano's father, whose father marries her. So what's the nature of that marriage? It's still kiddushay da'araisa, even though what she's a chareshes. Why I will say, because remember again, kiddushay kitana never needs the das of the girl, right? Remember again, that's the whole chap. The father has the ability to marry her off to whoever the father wants. Oh, again, the Gemara gives an eitzah, right, to the father, don't marry the girl. We saw this actually also a few days ago. Don't marry the kitan off to someone she doesn't want to be married to. But Lamaisa, the technical right is he has the ability to marry her off even without her das. So the Gemara, listen to this. So beget. Ultimately, again, she has the ability to go ahead and get divorced with the get. And I both say, why is that? Rashi says, who receives her get? Her father. Assuming that the husband wants to divorce her while she's still a kitana, ultimately, again, he could divorce her by giving her father the get. When she becomes a Gidola, both say it's a different story. Amrulo, af zuki yotzeba. They said to him, even this case of pikachash shenischarsha, ultimately, again, is like that case as well. We'll see what that statement means. Both say, let's get back now to Yibum. Right, here we go. Beis achin charshin nesuos labeis achayos charashos. Two cheresh brothers married to two cheresh sisters. O l'shtei achayos pikchos, or two cheresh brothers married to two regular women. Right, two again, sisters, all cases of brothers and sisters. Right, two sisters who are typical. O l'shtei achayos, or to two sisters, achas chareshes va'achas pikachos. One is a chareshes and one is a pikachos. O beis achayos charshos nesuos l'shnei achin pikchin. Or Rabbi said again, don't worry, we're going to go through all of these cases. Or you have two cheresh sisters married to two regular brothers. O l'shnei achin charshin, or two cheresh sisters married to two cheresh brothers. Oh, l'shnei achin, or to two brothers, echad cheresh ve'echad pikeach. One is a cheresh, one is a pikeach. Hare elu beturos min hayichalitza or min hayibom. The Rabbi say, this is not a chiddush. All of these cases are pater from chalitza and yibum. I will say, why? Why? Achos ishto. I would say, hey, it's such a build-up, so anti-chalanta. I would say, again, remember again, anytime you have two brothers married to two sisters, halach l'maisa, I will say, yibum is going to be an impossibility. Why? Because l'maisa, your sister-in-law is also what? Is also what? Your wife's sister. So it's an erva. So I will say, remember again, this is Yevamos Beis Amud Aleph. Once there's achos isha, so by definition, you're no yibum, no chalitza. Then hayu nachrios, then I will say, what if the two wives in question were not related? Then yachnosu could marry, then and ultimately, if you want to divorce them, you could then divorce them. In other words, you could do yibum, ultimately again, and then if you want to divorce, you could divorce. Shnei achin, again, I will say, we're going to go through all of these cases. Shnei achin, echad cherish ve'echad pikeach, two brothers, one is a cherish, one is a pikeach. Nisuim l'shtei achayos pikchos, that are married to two typical sisters, two regular sisters. Meis cherish bala pikachos. If ultimately, again, the cherish brother married to the regular woman dies, ma ya'aseh pikeach bala pikachos. What should the other brother who's also pikeach married to a regular woman do? Teitze mishum achos isha. Rabbi say there's no even chalitza. Why? Because it's his sister's wife. I'm sorry, his wife's sister. Meis pikeach bala pikachos ma ya'aseh cheresh bala pikachos. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. What happens if the pikeach brother who is married to the pikachas dies? And Rabbi say, here's the problem. Now the cheresh brother who's married to the pikachas, he only has a dirabanan marriage to his wife because he's a cheresh. So he only has a dirabanan marriage. So Rabbi say, so now what's the problem? He has a dirabanan marriage in what? A biblical yibum. So what does he do? Rabbi say, we've seen this case already. Motzi ishto beget ve'eshes achiv asro li'olam. So Rabbi say, he divorces his wife with a get. And then ultimately, again, here's the problem. The Yevamos is going to be asuratim anyway, because halacha l'maisa, again, she is the sister of his wife. Again, we'll get into all of these cases as well. Shnei achin pikchin, nisuin shtei achayos, two regular brothers married to two sisters, achos chareshes v'achos pikachos. One is a chirish, one is a pikachos. What happened? Meis pikeach bal chareshes, ma yaseh pikeach bal pikachas. So if the pikeach husband married to the chareshes dies, ultimately, again, what should the pikeach husband, the husband of the pikachas do? Teitze mishum achos isha. No yibam ultimately, and because it's his wife's sister. Meis pikeach bal pikachas, ma yaseh pikeach bal chareshes. But if the pikeach brother married to the pikachas dies, what should the pikeach brother married to the chareshes do? Motzies ishto beget. He divorces his wife, because also remember again, you have these clashes between rabbinic marriage and biblical yibum. So he divorces his wife with a get, and he does chalitza with his wife. Shnei achin echad cherish ve'echad pikeach. Two brothers, one is a cherish, one is a pikeach. Nisuin l'shtei achayos, married to two sisters. Achos chareshes ve'achos pikachos. One is a cherish and one is a pikachos. Meis cheresh bal chareshes. If the cheresh married to the chareshes dies, ma yaseh pikeach bal pikachas. What should the normal brother married to the normal woman do? Teitze mishum achos isha. Easy. Wife's sister, and therefore nothing. She leaves. Meis pikeach bal pikachas ma yaseh cheresh bal chareshes. I will say, what if the pikeach married to the pikachas dies? So now again, I will say, you have a biblical yibum falling to a brother only married in a rabbinic marriage. Ma'otzies ishto beget, he divorces his wife. Ve'eshes achiv asura the olam. And ultimately, again, his brother's wife is asur tim forever. Shnei achin echad cheresh ve'echad pikeach. Nisuin l'shtei nachrios. So I will say, what happens if you have two brothers, one a cheresh, one a pikeach, married to two unrelated women? So we'll say, now we're no longer, we'll say, all right, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up also with this last case of the Mishnah. We'll say, by the way, we're going to see all of these cases in the Gemara. Now we'll say the point of all of these cases is to set us up for this clash. We have this interesting thing, sometimes the clash between a rabbinic marriage and biblical yibum. Again, we actually saw this already in yesterday's daf. We'll see more of these cases, but again, we're going to get into the very, very interesting and riveting sugya tomorrow about the ability of a cheresh to affect marriage and what the true power of that marriage is. Shkoyach.
in cases where he has to give his wife and give Khalitsa to the other one, he's not a Kohen now. He could really
remarry. Yeah.
That's an easy solution.
Absolutely.
He's Kohen.
Absolutely. If his appointment doesn't work. Correct.